Again, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I guess the silver lining out of our pandemic experience was that we got used to communicate more and more virtually. So we got used to having meetings like that. So I wish the best for the success of this, so that more researchers will participate. And today I'm going to talk about research I'm doing. I did with Maurice Smith at Harvard, where I'm currently a research associate, about how motor learning and cerebellar damage, how it's affected, how different components of motor adaptation are affected by cerebellar damage. So that's the title we used when we first uploaded this work into PowerArchive. But then since then, we settled on a maybe slightly more provocative title we had in mind, which is the cerebellum as an analog to the medial temporal lobe for sensorimotor memory. The idea being that the medial temporal lobe has a role for declarative memories. It's necessary for long-term declarative memories, but not short-term declarative memories. What we're arguing for here is that the cerebellar does that. It's for sensorimotor memory. It's important for long-term sensorimotor memories, not so much for short-term sensorimotor memories. And before I jump in, I'll just give a very brief overview of the kind of questions I'm interested in. So I come from an engineering background. I'm now in the field of understanding motor learning and motor control in humans, both the fundamentals, but also understanding what's going wrong in patients with neurological disease. So this work is an example, people with cerebral degeneration. I'll also work on stroke patients, and I hope to do that in the future. And I think it's great to be able to look at both these domains at the same time, because there are many benefits, many synergies between those two domains of inquiry. For example, by understanding fundamentals of motor learning and control, we can use that to inform better rehabilitation, better measure deficits, help recovery. We can use the tools we developed for this, such as models or data tools, instrumentation, paradigms, and so on, and implement them on patients to better understand what's going on here. And at the same time, understanding the deficits in patients can go back and inform, we can glean something about the fundamentals of motor learning and motor control. For example, a patient has damage in area X. We can infer that area X is involved in this versus that versus the other behavioral component of motor learning or motor control. So back to this work, the motivation was from very classic work starting in the 1950s about the hippocampus and medial temporal lobe. So it's a famous example of patient HM, who following a bilateral removal of his hippocampus that was done to treat his seizures. At the time, they thought that would be the way to go. And after the operation, HM had no trouble recalling memories far in the past that were already consolidated in some sense. He got not much trouble holding short-term memories, so you could converse with him and chat, but he was unable to commit the short-term memories to long-term memories. He was unable to form new long-term memories. So this, that's work by Brenda Milner, Susan Corking, and the others, established the idea that the hippocampus is necessary for long-term, but not short-term declarative memories. And this made us ask the question, okay, is there something analogous, some other part of the brain that may be functionally similar for procedural, and in our case, specifically sensorimotor memories. And well, first that would be the cerebellum. And because the cerebellum is in general critical for motor function, of course, there are other functions to the cerebellum that we are coming to increasingly appreciate. But within our field, has long been assumed to be a substrate for adaptable internal models of the environment. That's what is important for motor adaptation. One of the most common paradigms in the study of motor learning. And in line with this, many studies have shown that the cerebellum is indeed involved in sensorimotor learning. For example, a few years ago, you have showed that stimulating the cerebellum using a nodal TDCS facilitates implicit sensorimotor learning. There's also a long list of studies of adaptation in patients with cerebral degeneration that show, as in this example by Rand Moorhead, that patients have trouble adapting. They adapt less, impairment in sensorimotor learning. And here's an example of, here we focus on patients with cerebellar ataxia. This is a particular example of spinocerebellar ataxia type 6, which is a more purely cerebellar one. And these patients, typically have, let me see if the video will play. They have issues with motor coordination. They might have dysmetria, disorganized, disordered movement, and so on. And as I also mentioned in the previous slide, they have issues with sensorimotor learning. I'm trying to move to that. And despite the, more or less universal evidence that there is some deficit for these patients with sensorimotor learning, the amount, the extent of this deficit, it can vary widely between different studies. For example, you have this study by Maurice Smith and Reza Shabmir from almost 20 years ago now. People are trained in a force field introduced here. Can you see my cursor? Hello?
Yes, we can see your cursor.
Oh, thank you. Just making sure. So the introduction of the force field, error is on the y-axis, x is trial number. The introduction of the error, the introduction of the force field results in a strong error on the first trial, around almost 20 degrees, like 18 degrees or something. These are control data, but with continued exposure to the force field, this error goes down. That's what we call a learning curve. Right, so there's learning here. With the cohort of patients with cerebral degeneration in the same study, again, the interaction of the force field induced a strong error, but with the continuous exposure to the force field, there is no further measurable, there's no big change in the amount, in the error. There's not a learning curve as there is over here, as if there's almost no sensorimotor learning happening. So in contrast to what could be interpreted as a near complete deficit for these cerebellar patients, other studies have shown that, yeah, patients with cerebral degeneration have deficits, but these are more moderate. This study by Sarah Krisimana Heminger and others from 2010, you see the interaction of the force field. These are also using the same paradigm as here, force field adaptation. Controls in blue, interaction with the force field results in some error. Controls improve, error goes almost to 0. And you have patients with severe cerebellar degeneration that was defined as an ICAR score of 40 or more. You see they have a high error at first, but with learning, as the training progresses, they more or less reduce the error by half. So that's like 50% learning, more or less, right? You compare this level to this level. And maybe even more better for patients in this study by Gibo and others, you see an initial error of about 11 degrees. it's reduced down to, I don't know, 3 or 4, which is roughly, I don't know, 60, 70% learning, in contrast to, I don't know, 10% or near 0. And if we were to look at the amount of learning for patients over the amount of learning for controls, roughly speaking, as a metric of impairment, 100% would be as that patients are as good as controls, that is no impairment. You find levels of 60, 70% for Gibo and others 2013, this study, and Krismana Heminger and others 2010, this study. But for this study, you find that it's hard to assess, actually. You see the error bars are big, but it's roughly, say, 20%. So what's causing this difference? So what we think is causing this difference is the experiment design behind these studies versus these studies. And in particular, a key aspect of it, which was how many target directions were present. Because target directions, the number of different target directions, if you present targets in random order, will dictate how long it takes from one trial to the next, what we call the inter-trial time interval, ITI. So in these two studies, ITIs were about 5 to 7 seconds. In this study by Smith and Shamir, they had 8 different movement directions. So if you were randomly sampling, it would take you longer to revisit a movement towards the same target on average, resulting in an average ITI intertrial time interval of about 20, 25 seconds. So is it that longer intertrial time intervals result in more impairment? And why would that be? Is because of the different components of sensorimotor learning. So I think at this point, most will have sort of an agreement that sensorimotor learning is not a monolithic process, but can be dissected into different components. Some you will dissect based on implicit versus explicit components, or components that can be dissected by modeling. Here we dissect adaptation into temporally persistent versus temporally volatile components based on how well they persist the passage of time. In this study, previous study, we trained people in a force field, and that entails essentially learning an ideal force shape. So these are point-to-point movements. So if you have a viscous force field, the ideal force will look more or less like this. And towards the end of initial training on asymptote, people are pretty good at compensating and thus exerting this ideal force. So they learn from producing something that's close to 0 up to the blue cyan over here. And then after initial training, people were exposed to a delay, delta t, then tested for retention, and then repeatedly retrained and retested. And you see here we sampled sampled 7 different values for delta t, ranging from 0, that is the minimum intertrial time interval, up to 2 minutes. And you see the longer the delta t is, the weaker the compensation is, suggesting there's some decay of adaptation over that time interval. And we can express that as an adaptation index. Adaptation is strongest when the delta t is 0, that is the intertrial time interval is minimal. And as more and more time passes before testing, adaptation decays. But you see, it doesn't decay much linearly. It declines rapidly with a time constant of about 20 seconds, and then levels off. So these are 2 minutes. It's very well approximated by an exponential. And you see there's a component that decays within 1 or 2 minutes. That's temporally volatile. It's like label against the passage of time. And there's a component that's persistent against the passage of time. It's more stable. Those two should have relabeled this. So this is the temporally volatile versus temporally persistent component. And interestingly, for some people in this study, an additional delta T of 20 minutes was tested, and you see that their level was more or less the same as it was at 2 or even 1 minute after learning, suggesting that this is it. This sort of this temporally persistent component is still there, even at 2 minutes, the same at 20 minutes. And this dichotomy between temporally persistent and temporally volatile adaptation, we also separately showed using a different paradigms. This is force field adaptation. We also show it for visual motor rotation adaptation with comparable time constants of decay, temporally volatile component, and a temporally persistent one. And interestingly, last year we showed that temporally persistent adaptation can lead to long-term retention 24 hours later. So here I'm showing an example from this paper we published last year in PLOS Biology, where we find that inter-individual differences, each dose is one individual, and the inter-individual differences in persistent adaptation on day 1 very well explain inter-individual differences in 24-hour retention at the beginning of day 2. And on average, 24-hour retention was more or less half of what the temporally persistent component was on day 1. In contrast, temporally volatile adaptation, well, decays between within 1 minute or 2, and thus cannot lead to long-term retention, right? So our hypothesis here, going back to cerebellar data, is that patients with cerebellar degeneration have a deficit specifically on temporally persistent rather than temporally volatile adaptation, which in turn will mean they rely more on temporally volatile adaptation. But whether you have temporally volatile adaptation or not is sensitive to how long it takes between trials in the first place, the intertrial time interval. So if the time between trials is long, as in the this is just a simulation. In the, for example, in the green line over here, the time between trials is long. So you see learning and then decay, learning and then decay. You won't be able to build up much adaptation. However, if the intertrial time interval is short, in this example, 3 seconds, if you learn and learn in the, say, more rapid succession, you will be able to have a higher level of volatile adaptation. Imagine you're like trying to feel your bike tire, and there is a small hole in it. If you keep pumping continuously, it would more or less settle as on some sort of asymptotic pressure within the tire. The task here, so to answer this hypothesis, we reanalyzed data from these 2 previous studies I mentioned earlier. One study by Sarah Krisimana Heminger et al., and another by Trisha Gibo et al. Trisha is also a co-author on this one, which used force field adaptation. Both of these studies had shooting through movement. So people from a start position would have to shoot through a target and land on a virtual pillow. And sometimes it would be perturbed by a viscous force field. And both studies had two separate sub-experiments, one in which this perturbation, the force field, was introduced abruptly, and another part where this perturbation was introduced gradually. And to take a first look at this data, and I guess I'll start from here, is that the 2010 study had 2 different movement directions. that meant that the distribution of intertrial time intervals could vary because these two targets were sampled randomly. Sometimes you would end up making a movement through this target and then making a movement through the same target again. That will result in a low ITI, intertrial time interval. So you will be on the left of this distribution. But other times you would have 2 or 3 or 4 intervening movements to the opposite direction, means it would take longer to revisit the same target, resulting in a longer ITI. So of course here ITI is measured as the time to revisit the same target. The 2013 study had only one target direction, resulting in a somewhat more compact distribution of ITIs. There are a few trials that were error clamp trials where error is clamped to 0, and thus there's no new learning happening. We counted that as simply time passing. So that's the, I don't know if you see the second bump over here. So there is also a distribution of ITIs. And if we first look at an overview of movement trajectories, in gray, you see these are control data. In gray, you see the error on the first force field movement. Here, the y-axis is on a different scale, of course, so we can see this better. And with learning, you see the blue traces here. People compensate most of this error, but you also see that they have learned better. They compensate the most when the intertrial time interval is low. And as you go towards the darker blue colors, this compensation gets less, and even less if you measure learning after a rest break, which amounts to an intertrial time interval of between 20 and 400 seconds. These were not very tightly controlled. And for patients, here are patients with severe cerebellar degeneration with an ICARS of more than 40. You see, if I measure movement that follows the movement in the same direction closely, that's yellow, with an ITI that's up to 4 seconds, you see people have reduced this initial error by roughly 2/3. But if I measure it after longer and longer ITIs, with the longest being after a break, this compensation decreases much more steeply than in this case. And to start looking at this more systematically, first we calculated the first step for the learning metric, beginning by the reaching angle at endpoint. That was the main metric used in those two studies. And you see the learning curves here. So controls are in blue. Patients with severe cerebellar degeneration are in red. You see that controls begin similar to patients. The initial errors are not that different, but as learning progresses, controls end up with very small residual errors. Patients end up with larger residual errors. This is the abrupt part of the experiment. Here you see the gradual part of the experiment. This is the 2013 study showing similar results. To systematically investigate this, we computed an adaptation index. So what's the fractional reduction relative to the first abrupt exposure to the force field? So say the initial error is 20 degrees, and on this trial, say I measured an error of 8 degrees. So that means I reduced error by 12 degrees, 12 out of 20. That will be an adaptation index of 0.6. If I were to reduce the error down to, I don't know, 2, it would be an adaptation index of 0.9. So yeah. And in this formula, we also made an adjustment to account for the gradual data, of course, since the errors are not, the perturbation is not the same throughout learning. So in the rest of the analysis, we focused on asymptote adaptation. We took that to be the last 75% of the data. You see more the learning curves here, asymptote around maybe a bit before that moment. And when we summarize the data first from trials within block, excluding non-post-break trials, we found that for controls, you have adaptation learning index around, I don't know, 0.86, 0.85. And if you measure the same after a break, it's lower, clearly lower. So on the x-axis, it's the inter-trial time interval. So it's about 0.6. So if we look at the previous data we collected, well, back in the day, that's sort of similar to what we saw then. You know, same task, forceful adaptation in healthy controls from 0.8 down to 0.6, very similar to what we see here. When we do the same analysis for patients with severe cerebral degeneration, we find that, well, excluding post-break trials, adaptation is reasonable, around almost 0.6. After a break, however, it decreases much more steeply compared to controls. It goes almost to 0. We divided adaptation. First, what remains after a break is the temporally persistent component. So earlier I showed that the time constant for decay of the temporally volatile adaptation is about 20 seconds. So by the average ITI here, you would be, which is 150 seconds or so, it will be essentially 0. So we can safely take these as temporally persistent. And the difference, the within block data would signify overall adaptation. The difference between those two would be the temporally volatile component. And we do the same for patients. When we summarize this, we clearly see that, of course, there's a deficit in overall adaptation. However, this deficit is much more clear for temporally persistent adaptation. Blue is control data, red is patient data. In contrast to what happens with temporally persistent adaptation, temporally volatile adaptation is nominally higher in patients compared to controls. And based on our hypothesis that, well, temporally persistent adaptation is specifically targeted, meaning leading to, which would then imply an increased role for temporally volatile learning. The difference between temporally persistent and temporally volatile adaptation, which is shown over here, shifts from positive in controls, meaning temporally persistent is stronger than temporally volatile, to negative in patients, meaning that temporally volatile is greater than temporally persistent. So this is clear evidence that it is temporally persistent than more than temporally volatile adaptation that is affected in cerebellar degeneration. And you think about if you include temporally volatile adaptation, that somehow moderates the apparent deficit you see when you look at overall adaptation only. Similar findings we found when we analyzed the 2010 and 2013 studies separately. One second. So up to this point, we basically relied on post-break trials, comparing them to the average of all the other trials. But earlier I showed that there's a good variability within each block in terms of inter-trial time interval. And if impairment is specific to temporally persistent adaptation, we will predict that the decay over short inter-trial time intervals like this will be steeper for patients. So what we did here was to compare the ITI. It's a relative ITI because I'm centering it around the average for each participant. So I just show the data all together. So as ITI increases, the relative learning index, which is essentially the fraction of within block adaptation that decays per unit time, we predict that to be the slope here will be steeper in patients compared to controls. So here you see control data. Each point is just one trial, so it's hard to see a pattern here. But if we fit regression lines to each individual's data, you see clearly, well, these are almost exclusively negative slopes. As you would expect, adaptation decays with time. These are control data. These are patient data. They're, of course, more noisy, but on average, they're clearly decaying at a much steeper rate than controls, roughly twice as steep decay within block adaptation versus time. So this is in line with the idea that within blocks in the severe cerebellar patient data, a greater fraction of adaptation was temporally volatile, in line with the deficit that's specific to temporally persistent adaptation. And we see the same when we look at the two studies separately. And finally, we went back to the literature, and we found 15 previous studies other than the two reanalyzed for which studied sensorimotor learning in patients with cerebellar degeneration. So while timing data was not available for these studies, we could still make assumptions as to how long the intertrial time intervals would be in each study by going through the methods and taking into account how many different targets were present for each study. So studies that would have many targets, 4 up to 8. I think this was the range we found. When you have many targets and you visit them randomly, it would take, on average, longer to revisit the same target, meaning that ITI, intertrial time interval, would be large. Large ITI would predict more impairment because you have to rely more on temporally persistent adaptation. For studies with few targets and hence likely to have a lower ITI, you'll be able to build up temporally volatile adaptation and thus have more less impairment. And indeed, when we analyzed the impairment, we compared the impairment at each study. We found that studies with a few targets have more or less 2 to 3 times, I think it's closer to 3 times less deficit compared to studies with many targets, 4 to 8 targets, which also explain a large fraction of the across study variance. So this difference is in line with the idea that cerebellar degeneration impairs temporally persistent rather than temporally volatile learning. And before wrapping up what I have so far, just mention that here we focus on patients with severe cerebellar degeneration, following the distinction made in the first study from 2012. We also here we also looked at the data from patients with mild cerebellar degeneration. And you see that more or less their metrics are in between controls and patients with severe cerebral degeneration, overall adaptation, well, persistent learning index, the difference between persistent and volatile adaptation, Also, if I look at what happens across individuals for each one of those metrics, so based on severity, higher ICAR score means more severity. The cutoff was 40. Control data are here. This temporally persistent adaptation, where you see an impairment. But also now you see that people with mild cerebral degeneration lie solidly in between the average of those two. If I were to fit a line for patients only, it would give me a pretty good fit. If I added controls as participants with an ICARS of 0, the slope would be more or less the same, but this fit would be stronger, suggesting there's indeed some sort of smooth gradient from controls to people with mild cerebellar degeneration to severe cerebellar degeneration. And this is the same for our other main metric, which is the difference between temporally persistent and temporally volatile adaptation. And a last point to make related to that is, okay, so it seems that patients with cerebral degeneration are able to use temporally volatile learning to, even though temporally persistent learning is impaired. But what is temporally volatile learning? Could it be simply people strategizing? Well, we don't think that's the case, and through the series of many reasons, we find this unlikely, but we actually tested this in separate work. This part was spearheaded by Ryan Moorhead, where we did this same experiment to understand decay of adaptation in healthy individuals. We trained them on visual motor rotation. We exposed them to a delay delta t. We tested them for retention, retrained and retested continuously. But at the same time, we dissected adaptation into implicit and explicit components using AIM reports. And here you see total adaptation, that is implicit plus explicit, how it decays with time. That's a decay curve similar to the ones I showed early in this presentation. And implicit learning is lower, but look how well it parallels what happens here, shows more or less the same degree of decay. And in contrast, explicit learning is pretty flat, suggesting that it does not decay with time. Explicit learning is basically temporally persistent. Hence, what we measure as temporally volatile learning is implicit. So maybe there's an implicit component that relies on the cerebellum and it's temporally persistent, but there's another implicit component that's temporally volatile and does not rely on it. To summarize, we argue how motor adaptation is characterized by distinct temporally volatile and temporally persistent components, and that cerebellar damage specifically targets the temporally persistent component of motor adaptation. And this can explain both the differences in reported deficits across previous studies, but also trial-to-trial fluctuations within these studies. Previous work showed that temporally persistent but not temporally volatile adaptation leads to long-term retention. So this is akin to the role of the middle temporal lobe, the hippocampus. So that is, the cerebellum is critical for long-term but not short-term sensorimotor memories. The hippocampus or middle temporal lobe is important for longer term, but not short-term declarative memories. At this point, I want to thank you for listening. My collaborators on this, Maurice Smith and Trisha Gibo, who was also in the other two studies as well. Also Sarah Krisimana Heminger and Amy Bashian, who helped us get the data and gave us valuable input on this. At this point, I'd like to take your questions. Thank you for your attention. So I might stop my sharing for a second just to see this, see everybody on the screen again.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, Alkis. That was really, really compelling data. I must say, really beautiful data. Thank you so much. And it triggers a lot of thought about. I mean, I've heard I've listened to presentations about these temporally volatile and these components, and yeah, I think, you know, in this instance, it really makes me really want to rethink about the way I've designed my experiments, the 8-target design, 1-target design, and so on, and what are the implications of that. I'd like to check. So we had someone raise their hand up for questions just now. Yeah, David has a question, but Kim also raised her hand earlier. Kim, was that intentional? Just before David raised his hand, Kim.
That was an accident. Sorry.
Okay, no. Okay. Yeah, David.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Thanks for the really fascinating talk. I just was curious if given that you're using target directions as a kind of proxy for ITI, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about alternative explanations having to do with cerebellar damage and just, you know, taxing memory when you've got to remember, when they have to remember reaching to multiple targets. And I'm just wondering if you guys have run the experiment, or if that actually exists in the literature. I'm just unaware, where basically instead of manipulating target number, it's just directly manipulating ITI and looking at whether the effects that you're reporting are the same.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's work on framework that focuses on the effect of having multiple targets on explicit components of adaptation, which we don't think are much in play here. I think there's some McDougall had something. So what I think is happening is well, we see similar results in the Gibo et al. 2013 data, which only had one target, so that adaptation after a break is more or less as strongly affected compared to within block trials. So I don't think that would be a big effect. It would be good for, you know, in the future, for future research to let's trace the decay curves of the cerebellar patients in a pretty dense intertrial sort of sampling, similar to what we did with healthy controls in previous work, to see if there are any other differences. Is the volatile component more or less volatile after all that? I do not expect to find a big difference to what I think most of the effect of having the different targets is the ITI. That will probably be different with learning.
Thanks.
Tim had a question. You're muted, Tim. Tim, you're muted.
Oh. Sorry about that. Thank you for the talk, Alkis. Had a couple of questions around how you see these ideas integrated with some of the previous conceptions around various types of learning and ways that learning are developed. So obviously there's, you touched on the implicit-explicit dichotomy, but there might be other multiple components of each of those things potentially, which I guess you alluded to. Also, there's our group's already thought a lot about, you know, the type of errors that you receive might influence or drive different kinds of learning as well. And also then you've got, you know, ideas around error sensitivity. So and whether, you know, how the designs and the results that you have might play out to, you know, is there a decay, like a time sensitive error sensitivity effect, for example, that might exist? So I mean, it's a really long, multifaceted question. I'm interested in all of them, but maybe if you could target, say, the implicit explicit a little bit more directly. I wasn't sure if I've got the full evidence from the Moorhead paper about what you were saying around what was the evidence that it was an implicit effect rather than explicit. Could you maybe go back to that? And,
yes. 1 second. Let me wait. I need to give me 1 second to restart the. Wait, I'll split my screen and I go back to that slide 1 second. Oh, sure. Yeah, so yeah, this is still in preparation, and so here we have this this design. You know, we train people to asymptote, let some time pass, test for retention, retrain, and retest. And the time interval goes up to 90 seconds. Total learning is implicit plus explicit, right? You see this decays more or less as you would expect based on previous work. So there's the time constant is roughly 14, 15 seconds. And when you isolate implicit learning out of all this using AIM reports, it decays.
AIM reports, right?
Yeah, or as much as total learning. Whereas explicit learning is flat, doesn't change based on the time since the last training trial. So this flatness here makes us think that, well, shows that, you know, this explicit sensorimotor learning is temporally persistent. And
yeah, okay. So I mean, that's, yeah. So obviously there's lots of ways that you can get insight about a distinction between implicit and explicit, and you know, certainly AIM report is by definition explicit, but it may not be excluding it may not be a full summary of the explicit component as well, right? So
no, I totally agree with that. So sometimes you can have exclusion trials tell people to stop aiming. You might get something different. I mean, there's some more papers that are relevant to this. I think there's a paper. Well, no, there was a paper like I have an example here for a few years ago that tried to see how strategy works in force field learning, and force field training happens here. Catch trials are essentially the standard AeroClam trials. So this is overall learning basically in orange. And they had push and no push trials. No push is essentially an exclusion trial. That is, in the next trial, the robot would not, you know, exert force or something on you, withhold whatever strategy you have. So I don't remember the exact instructions. These are in green. And, you know, even if with this very direct design, the amount of basically explicit force field adaptation, which is the difference between, sorry for that, between the orange and the green is rather small.
Yeah, so, I guess, yeah. So it kind of depends whether you think of the implicit explicit dichotomy as conscious intention to do something, or the ability to, whether it's obligatory or not, the ability to remove it voluntarily if it's not there. So, and again, I guess, you know, different measures of implicit explicit will probably give you slightly different answers. But I mean, I guess the result that you have is a good starting point, and it's certainly suggestive to me that, you know, it does seem to be more along the lines of something that's obligatory than something that can be turned on and off. But I guess I'd just be conscious of wanting to test it multiple ways to be really sure of that.
No, I agree. But you know, at the same time, we find more or less the same result when we look at the gradual learning data, which, of course, that's not a 100.0% exact science, but we expect that gradual introduction of probation minimizes, you know, these explicit strategies, and we still see the same results.
No, thank you for that. I mean, I don't want to dominate time. I'll give other people a chance to ask questions. But do you have any thoughts on the error sensitivity issue? Have you thought about that?
That's I have thoughts. These thoughts are not, we're not able to look at them in this study. You need to look at resistant sensitivity. You basically need to look at repeatedly. We looked a bit at early learning actually, but they're only but I think that which suggested that it did suggest that early learning was a bit less impaired, in line with a strong volatile but compromised persistent. But what we have to do to exactly see for error sensitivity is simply do single trial presentations of force fields, measure the error, the learning rate in triplets. What I think happens is that well, the learning rate for temporally volatile adaptation is the same. It's not affected. That's what I think. It's just that volatile learning is stronger because the error is bigger, because temporally persistent is not accounting for as much error as it would normally do. I guess the question I did not touch, which is basically what's wrong with the temporally persistent process? Is it the retention rate or the learning rate? I guess I have to say I don't know. I guess trying to look at the rate of learning for a slow learning process such as temporally persistent would be harder, but we could figure it out through using modeling. Yeah,
well, I guess if you consider that the state isn't necessarily changing from trial to trial, so I would assume it would have to be a retention issue if you've got the same state and then you test again later and it's changed. Your state space model shouldn't change until you get a different error or a different outcome. So then, so you only get a learning rate effect when you get a larger or smaller error. So which you shouldn't have until you get a different outcome. So yeah. Anyway, I appreciate the thoughts. Thank you.
I had a question. If no one else haven't checked, yeah, I have a question. Can you speculate for me? What do you think the neural substrates of the volatile component are?
Oh, yeah. I'll probably say the short answer is I'm just speculating here. I would say something in the motor or supplementary motor areas, but yes, the answer is I'm not sure.
Supplementary motor area. Okay, yeah. Why? I don't know much about this literature. Yeah, I hope you can illuminate.
Yeah, well, I don't really have a strong hypothesis for anything. Just if it's not in the cerebellum, just in other areas involved in motor learning.
I have a follow-up question I might ask quickly. So I find it interesting that, you defined ITIs as whether you have one target versus 8 targets. And another way you can actually conceptualize that is whether there is use-dependent plasticity when you revisit the same target versus when you have multiple targets. I guess based on that, could you think that use-dependent plasticity effects could contribute to some of the effects you see?
I would say that's. I mean, use-dependent effects are, they're generally present, but they're also generally small. So I would say yes, that's possible. That's possible, but also it would be a fraction of what we see here. And in any case, we see the same result with the one target study.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Another one, if that's okay. So I guess it's the converse of Leanne's question about, well, what's the, you have cerebellar damage and you can't produce long-term stable memories, sensorimotor memories, but you still can do short-term corrections that are temporally volatile. So what do you think's allowing you to make these temporary volatile short-term memories if the cerebellum's not involved, which is, I guess most people would probably think that cerebellum's kind of crucial for understanding the nature of the error and allowing you to correct for it.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, my guess would be something. As I said, certainly circuits involving the motor cortex, for example, or other areas involved in motor learning. Just something outside the part of the cerebellum that are affected. It could also be. I don't remember very well, but you know, in some cases, there might be differential damage within the cerebellum, so it might be that you have the deep nuclei being more involved, and but the cerebellar cortex. But I'm not. Yeah, I don't remember the studies right now.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
I did wonder whether basal ganglia could be involved, but yeah, anyway.
Yeah, well, would imagine it would be something a bit more like on the reward-based learning related, you think, in that case?
I don't know. I always thought that these types of paradigms always have reward implications. It's always frustrating to have something push you away, and then you're gonna, yeah. So yeah, and then I thought because there was the old data, I must confess I have, I guess, a conflict of interest. My PhD was looking at impaired savings in Parkinson's disease, which is actually just extensions of old data that shows that. That's why I suspected basal ganglia. But yeah, it would be yeah, interesting to think more about this. Cool. Baba's question. Let's say you learn to move towards one target with ITI of 20 seconds versus 4 target with ITI of 5 seconds. Would you predict similar effects?
I mean, the ITI, so would be, I assume you mean it's 5 seconds between the different targets, not that you're moving much more rapidly towards the same target. Yes, I would say, yes, it will be more or less the same. There is only maybe that's very small component of use-dependent learning that's helping you when you have only one target, maybe. Imagine we'll be able to detect that with enough power. But yeah, I would predict something similar. Of course, it depends. You know, it also depends. It's not any 4 targets. It's 4 targets. Yeah, always assume that the targets are distributed reasonably far apart from each other. Of course, so there's no transfer of learning between neighboring targets. Yeah. Yeah, there will be little transfer there. So I would expect more or less the same thing.
David? You're muted, David.
Sorry, I have to, everyone there. Every meeting requires at least one person who's talking while muted. Just building on Tim's question and comment, I was just curious if you had any thoughts about or knew from the literature that you were drawing upon whether the visual feedback was continuous or just provided an endpoint. And you know, I think that seems like there are definitely some interesting results related to the timing of feedback and the availability of feedback, and that also seems to kind of indicate that there's also a difference between visuomotor adaptation, some visuomotor adaptation studies, and force field adaptation, which is basically continuous. And just wondering if there's any literature that you're aware of, or you know the answer to the question just directly about whether that could be playing a role in these cerebellar patients, and maybe there's some differences. Maybe that could kind of provide the sort of substrate for performance in you know these short-term these short ITIs? I don't know, just sort of it's not a well-formed question, just sort of really just more hoping that you have you can form it into a really good question and answer it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for forceful adaptation, such as the studies we looked at, it's you essentially get continuous information. Endpoint versus continuous feedback is a bigger issue in visual motor rotation learning, where but your only error is what you see either at the end or throughout the movement. I would think that well, because endpoint paradigms tend to promote explicit over implicit, and it will then depend on how explicit learning is affected in cerebellar degeneration. And there's some studies. There's a study in 2017 by Peter Butcher where they found that people with cerebellar degeneration were similarly affected in explicit learning as they were in implicit sensorimotor learning. And if you believe me that this is template persistent, then you would have more deficit in endpoint feedback learning studies rather than continuous feedback studies, which this continuous feedback gives more drive to the rise of implicit components. And since within implicit lies that temporally volatile that here helped us, you'll have less of an apparent impairment. I think.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess just tying it, just so I could follow up, just tying in with what Leanne's question in your answer to it, in terms of, you said maybe the temporally volatile component might be supported by frontal motor areas, which I guess one way of thinking about part of what they're doing is integrating feedback to kind of correct movements while they're going, rather than just plan it, just anyway, it's a sort of, it's a really it's a hornet's nest of kind of issues there, but I wonder if you thought anything about that.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. I haven't made many. I haven't thought about it. That I haven't come up with any compelling. Let's say this might be it.
I guess I want to follow up on that as well. Sorry to hammer away at the same thing, but the papers that you looked at in detail use the pillow version, so they were shooting movements as well, and so there's some argument that some kinds of forceful learning benefit from having the feedback corrections as a teaching signal for the feed-forward component, for example. So if you're moving very rapidly and you're not getting a strong feedback correction, that's at least able to be a teaching signal because it's not causing success, that might have an effect, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, I guess it'd be interesting to see if everything still holds in a case we have an endpoint task where you have to try and stop on the targets. But do you know why the pillow was chosen, like the shooting was chosen in those particular studies? Is that something that
I'm not sure why they made that design decision. I mean, they're probably, my guess would be that these movements are probably easier to assess in terms of reaching, and then having patients stop at the target can be, at least my experience is with stroke patients, which is a totally different thing, but most of the issue they have is coming to a stop. I would imagine with the disordered movement in cerebellar ataxia, you would have an issue as well. I haven't discussed that with either Sarah or Tricia.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm conscious, that it's, Tim has a question, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, I thought it was down. I wanted to put it down.
Okay. Yeah, we might actually